Welcome everyone to our Sunday morning program. I hope you've all been well. Today we're going to start off with an opening prayer read by Padia and then followed by an introductory reading read by Bayan.
You'll need to unmute.
Glorified be thou, O my God. Behold thou my head ready to fall before the sword of thy will, my neck prepared to bear the chains of thy desire, my heart yearning to be made a target for the darts of thy decree, mine eyes expectant to gaze on the tokens and signs of thy wondrous mercy. For whatsoever may befall me from thee is the cherished desire of them who thirst to meet me, and the supreme aspiration of such as have drawn nigh unto thy court. By the glory of thy might, O thou my well-beloved, to have sacrificed my life for the manifestations of thyself, to have offered up my soul in the path of the revealers of thy wondrous beauty, is to have sacrificed my spirit for thy spirit, my being for thy being, my glory for thy glory. It is as if I had offered up all these things for thy sake, and for the sake of thy loved ones. Though my body be painted by the trials that befall me from thee, though it be afflicted by the revelations of thy decree, yet my soul rejoiceth at having partaken of the waters of thy beauty, and at having attained the shores of the ocean of thine eternity. Doth it beseem a lover to flee from his beloved, or to desert the object of his heart's desire? Nay, we all believe in thee, and eagerly hope to enter thy presence. Baha'u'llah.
The world is but a show, vain and empty, a mere nothing, bearing the semblance of reality. Set not your affections upon it. Break not the bond that united you with your Creator, and be not of those that have erred and strayed from his ways. Verily I say, the world is like the vapor in a desert, which the thirsty dreameth to be water and striveth after it with all his might, until when he cometh unto it, he findeth it to be a mere illusion. It may, moreover, be likened unto the lifeless image of the beloved, whom the lover hath sought and found, in the end, after long search and to his utmost regret, to be such as cannot fatten nor appease his hunger. O my servants, sorrow not if, in these days and on this earthly plane, things contrary to your wishes have been ordained and manifested by God. For days of blissful joy, of heavenly delight, are assuredly in store for you. Worlds, holy and spiritually glorious, will be unveiled to your eyes. You are destined by him, in this world and hereafter, to partake of their benefits, to share in their joys, and to obtain a portion of their sustaining grace. To each and every one of them you will, no doubt, attain. Poem.
Thank you. So before we get started, I just wanted to remind everyone about the procedure we're going to use for today. So we're first going to have our speaker present her talk with a PowerPoint, and then please save all your questions to after that. And the way you can ask your questions is either in the chat box, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. There's a button that says chat, or you can raise your hand by clicking the participants button at the bottom of your screen. And then there's a blue raise hand button on the right side of your computer. And then we'll go through and unmute you when it's your turn to ask your question. So today, our speaker is Mrs. Sovaida Maani, and the topic of her talk is the coronavirus, Catapult to a Better Future. Mrs. Maani Ewing is the founder and director of the Center for Peace and Global Governance, a virtual think tank and online forum that pools and proposes principled solutions to pressing global problems through publications, podcasts, lectures, workshops, and targeted consulting. She's an international lawyer experienced in private and government practice, both in England as a barrister at law and the United States as a licensed attorney. She's the author of Collective Security Within Reach, and Building a World Federation, The Key to Resolving Our Global Crises, and is co-author of Laws of the Kitab al-Aqdas. She maintains a blog that discusses current global issues and proposes principled solutions to them. Mrs. Sovaida Maani Ewing was born in Kenya, spent several years attending school in Haifa, Israel, lived in the UK for 9 years, and subsequently moved to the United States. So please join me in welcoming Mrs. Maani.
Thank you very much for that gracious introduction, Pemane. Well, it's a pleasure to be with you all, even though we're doing this via Zoom. Zoom has its own benefits. It means that you don't have to get out of bed in the morning, even, I guess some of you could even be in bed as long as you're not on video. And you certainly don't have to get into your cars and trek anywhere. So it's one of the benefits we have. We can attend lots of meetings from the comfort of our own homes. All right, to the topic, the coronavirus pandemic, catapult to a better future. I want to kick off this discussion with a quote from Baha'u'llah, the prophet founder of the Baha'i faith. He says, "Be anxiously concerned with the needs of the age ye live in, and center your deliberations on its exigencies and requirements." Well, if we're going to be anxiously concerned about anything today, we definitely have right before us twin global crises, the pandemic, COVID-19, and also the global economic recession, which experts tell us is going to be the worst recession we've ever had since the Great Depression. It's going to be worse than the Great Depression. We're not going to spend a lot of time mired in the details of how awful these two tragedies are, right? We know that they have inflicted a lot of physical suffering, a lot of mental and psychological suffering, caused a lot of deaths, decimated a lot of jobs and livelihoods. So the question we really want to focus on today is, what are we going to do? How are we going to choose to respond? And there are essentially two big choices before us. One is to think of these tragedies as an absolute catastrophe from which we won't recover, or, you know, our lives are over as we know them and woe is us. Or we can think of them as a golden opportunity. Shock horror, what an interesting way of casting it. In other words, what actually matters here is our mindset. Mindset is absolutely critical to determining what we do going forward. So what do we mean by the word mindset? Mindset essentially is made up of two things. It's the lens through which we choose to interpret our reality. It is the way we interpret our past experiences, either as individuals or as a community or as a global community. It is the way we regard ourselves, what we believe about ourselves. Who are we? What is our nature? Are we basically good or bad? What are the qualities that animate us? What are our beliefs? It also is determined by what our assumptions are about how the world works and how the world should work. It also encompasses our values. What is it that drives us? What are our core values? All of these make up what we call our mindset. And depending on how we do any of these things, what our assumptions are, how we think the world works, how we interpret our experiences, etc., will determine how we choose to act going forward. And this brings us to the second element of mindset. Mindset determines how we choose to react in any situation, which is really, really important. As the famous 20th century psychologist Viktor Frankl pointed out, this idea of choice that we have about how we react is fundamental to who we are as human beings. He described it actually very interestingly as a spiritual freedom, which I thought was a very interesting way of describing free will choice, our choice particularly to react to whatever life throws at us. And he also said that this choice about how we react is illustrative of our independence of mind. And he said it's the thing that gives our lives meaning. If you haven't read his book, he's written several of them, I highly commend them to you. And you know, he was in the concentration camps in Europe, and he said he observed firsthand how individuals subject to the same horrible conditions, that of a concentration camp in which they're trying to annihilate you, chose to respond. And he gives this very small example. He said he himself noticed many times that some people would act, as he said, as angels, and others would choose to react as swines. And he talks about it in the context of the little pieces of bread that they were given at the beginning of each day, a dry crust of bread. He said some people would look around to see who needed it more than they did and would share their bread with those others. On the other hand, he said there were a few people who would wait for any opportunity, and then as soon as somebody had turned their back, steal their piece of bread away from them. So even though all were subject to the same horrific conditions, the choices they made about reaction was different. So let's look at what our typical mindset is as human beings today. If you look at any situation, whether in your personal life or in your local community or the global community right now with the pandemic, you see that we have one of two main reactions. The first reaction goes like this: oh, poor me, or poor us. We're at the mercy of uncontrollable events. This is so terrible. It's a cause for depression. We feel anxious. Life is out of control. What does it matter what I do? So I hear some students say, what's the point in studying? Our world's never going to be the same again. I'm not going to be able to get a job. So what is this all for? Basically, we end up giving up. The second typical reaction is that of anger, of, wait a minute, how could this be happening to us? We become angry. We tend to go immediately to blame. We want to find somebody or a group of people to blame. Oh, it's the fault of this nation or that nation. It's the fault of the blacks or the whites. It's the fault of the rich people. No, it's the fault of the poor. It's the fault of the women or the entitled men. It's always somebody else who's the problem. We feel frustrated, we feel resentful, we feel suspicious of other people, and ultimately we tend to feel a lot of anger, and often it ends up translating into violence. So it's fascinating when we look again even at the COVID-19, we're starting to experience, especially this week or this weekend, Memorial Day weekend, with the lockdown easing in a number of states, a lot of angry people, right? Those who don't want to have to wear masks anymore, who are angry at reporters on their beaches who are wearing masks and they're yelling at them, take your masks off, take your masks off, or vice versa. Those who believe that it's still important to wear masks and who are yelling at those who are not wearing them and saying, put your masks on, put your masks on. And we've already seen in the news that it has led to fisticuffs and some violence, including, you know, police being pushed around and thrown into the water and so on. So these are our two main settings, if you like. This is what we seem to generally do. Now, what's the problem with this mindset, these two mindsets? It's that they form essentially a stumbling block. When we come from one of these two places that we talked about, what it leads to is either helplessness, fear, anxiety, and depression. And what happens when you're feeling down? We lose all our energy. We get very apathetic and lethargic. We don't want to get out of bed in the mornings, let alone do anything. And it then leads to inaction. Or if we act after having procrastinated usually quite a while, it leads to half-baked action. Again, look at COVID. Look at the wave in our leadership around the world in most places, with the exception of a few stellar countries. They've really set wonderful examples. But with the exception of a few, most leaders have taken action too little, too late. Took a while before many figured out that we needed to do the physical distancing, and then a while to figure out that masks were really important. For a while, in this country, we were told, don't wear masks. They don't help. And then we did this turnaround that said, oh, you absolutely have to do masks. They protect others. So I protect you, you protect me by wearing masks. And so there are all these delayed actions. We procrastinated, we delayed. And then when we took action, it was always kind of half-baked. We haven't had a national policy. We've left it to different states to do what they want. And even with the opening up of the economy now, everybody's going their own way, even though we live in one country, we're all interconnected. It's not like we have closed borders between our 50 states. And yet this is how we're going. And other countries are finding the same problem. We're by no means alone in this. So in sum, this mindset, these two mindsets that we talked about, lead to paralysis of will. And that, I believe, is our biggest danger. It's not the virus that's our biggest danger. It's the way we choose to respond to it. These mindsets, these are what constitute our biggest threat. Unfortunately, both of these responses are destructive. They're self-destructive, and they don't serve us for many reasons. One of the things they do is they blinker our perception of the choices and options that we actually do have. We're so busy either feeling sorry for ourselves, oh, poor us, you know, what are we going to do? We're helpless. Or we're so busy being angry that we don't actually get to be creative at a time when we most need to be creative, nor are we seeing the range of options before us, which we will discuss. It's interesting that the son of the prophet founder of the Baha'i faith, who was also his successor and the authorized interpreter of his writings, warned the American Baha'i community shortly before his death in 1921 that we would be subjected to immense mental suffering. And he said, trust me on this one, basically, don't take this lightly. These things are going to be heavy on you and will crush you if you're not careful. That I'm paraphrasing. He didn't use the word crush. His successor, Shohi Effendi, the guardian of the Baha'i faith, reminded the Baha'i community about this. And there's this wonderful quotation, which I want to read to you, in which he tells us that we have to be careful not to fall into the same pit that others fall into who start feeling pessimistic and despondent and giving up. Here's what he says. It's a really amazing quote. He says, we must expect these things. He's talking about difficulty and suffering. It is becoming evident that the world is not yet through with its labor. Labor is in giving birth. The new age not yet fully born. Real peace not yet right around the corner. Now here's the kicker. All humanity is disturbed and suffering and confused. Does that sound familiar? Disturbed, suffering, and confused. We, meaning the Baha'i community whom he's addressing here, cannot expect to not be disturbed and not to suffer. So yes, our family members are going to die of COVID-19, and we are going to all suffer, and yes, the economy is going to affect all of us. He says, so we cannot expect to not be disturbed and not to suffer, but we don't have to be confused. On the contrary, he says, confidence and assurance, hope and optimism are our prerogative. So this, when I see what's going on around us right now, this mindset and the self-destructive attitudes it's bringing out, I think of what Shoghi Effendi said and the warnings that Abdul Baha gave us. There is another thing that happens when we have these kinds of mindsets, and psychologists talk about it. There's particularly a fellow out at Harvard University, Shauna Khor, who talks about what human beings normally do when we face difficulties. He says we tend to have one of two reactions. We either do more of the same, somehow believing that magically the result is going to be different, or we start taking steps back, retrogressing, thinking, oh, if we just pull back from what we've been doing, things will get better. Now, again, you see this at play in the COVID crisis, and it's just fascinating. So initially it was, oh, don't worry about it. It'll just go away. Just keep doing more of what you're doing. We're all good. We're all okay. This is a very natural psychological reaction. The second one, which is taking several steps back. So after we implemented social distancing and masks, now we automatically want to roll things back, and we want to roll things back very fast. We've made progress in bringing numbers down to a certain extent, and yet we don't have the fortitude to stick to it, to take it to where it needs to be for the entire national community to be safe. So I find this very interesting. And this gentleman, the psychologist, says there is a third path. And this is what this whole rest of the presentation is going to be about. And here's what the third path is. He says, instead of doing these two things, either of these two things, the third option is for us to use the momentum that comes from failure, temporary failure. So here we are sinking with the COVID crisis, with the economy collapsing. He says, use the momentum from this failure to catapult ourselves in a new direction that we've never thought about before. In other words, it requires a lot of mental space, clarity, and creativity to come up with completely new ways of doing things and new ways of being. So let's move on to that, because that's really the nub of this. So what can we choose as a mindset to substitute for these two negative mindsets that we talked about? We said that those mindsets were like a stumbling block. So is there a mindset we can adopt that becomes a stepping stone to a better future? So the Baha'i writings provide us with an amazing gift. All faiths do, but because the Baha'i faith is the latest in a series of progressive revelations that comes to meet the needs of humanity at a given time and to meet us where we are in terms of our capacities, these particular mindsets that are offered by the Baha'i faith resonate, at least for me particularly, with our dire needs today. They offer us basically, the writings, the Baha'i writings offer us a new set of lenses. So if you think of your glasses, you can wear lenses that make the world look fuzzy. You can wear lenses that make the world look red or blue or green, depending on what kind of lenses you wear. So in my conception, the Baha'i writings provide us with a way of interpreting the world, looking at it and understanding it, that allow us to display the kind of creativity that psychologist was talking about, to come up with new ways of being so that we can create a better world. Let's just dive into what some of these lenses are. Lens one, the Baha'i writings tell us that what is happening is not random. It's not an accident. This isn't something uncontrollable that just happened to happen. And oh boy, we're victims of it now. These calamities are collective tests designed by the Creator to educate us. And they are ripe with opportunities, they bring certain gifts, and they serve some very specific purposes. So let's look and see, what do we mean? What are these opportunities and purposes? Another lens that the writings provide us tells us that tells us that humanity as a collective whole has been going through a period of growth, that human history is a story of the evolution of humanity, and that as a collective whole, humanity is now going through a stage of turbulent adolescence that will lead eventually to its maturity, the birthing of a new order that is marked by peace, security, and unity. However, this birthing of the new order is a messy process. You know that when a woman gives birth, she goes through labors, right? And the labors are marked by contractions that increase in number, in frequency, and in intensity. And the pain gets pretty awful towards the end there when the child is about to be born. Think about all the global crises that we've been steadily having for 2 or 3 decades now. We've had repeated genocides. We've had repeated instances of nations having secret nuclear weapons programs. We have had repeated financial crises. Each has gotten more severe than the other. The last one was the 2008 global financial crisis. This one now that's been triggered by the pandemic, they're telling us is going to be worse than that one and worse than the Great Depression. And then the pandemic, we have had a series of scares. We had the Ebola scare, we had the SARS scare, we had the, the H1N1 scare, we had the MERS scare in the Middle East. And now, and we kept saying, oh, thank gosh, yes, we got complacent. Oh, we can deal with these things. Well, turns out that we can't. We didn't prepare for this global pandemic, and now we're really stuck in it. So it's going to be messy. But if we keep in mind that the end result, which is the birthing, is the new world order, which we'll talk about a little bit later, when we realize that that's the goal, we will see that all of this will have been worth it. Okay, the third lens, which is one of the ones, it's one of my favorites, is that when Baha'u'llah came, he says he released into the world, as have all the prophets of the past at their coming, spiritual energies. These spiritual energies, he tells us, have led to a dual process being kicked off, a simultaneous parallel process of integration and disintegration. This dual process has a purpose. Its purpose, well, I'll first tell you the purpose and then I'll tell you how we're going to get there, is to raise the consciousness of the oneness of humanity. We're starting to see this at work with the COVID-19 crisis. We're starting to see real time, all of us becoming aware that every choice we take, every action we take affects other people, affects others in our family. So if you're a young person and you think, oh, I can go out and party with my friends, young people don't really catch COVID-19 so much and it's not so bad for us, but then you come home and your parents are in their mid-40s or 50s and your grandparents are around, you are likely to cause them a lot of suffering if you pass that disease on, and a good chance that one of them will die. So our actions actually have consequences. Why? Because we're so interconnected. We're starting to notice that with everything. We thought when China closed itself off with its severe lockdown that, oh, it's their problem. They'll deal with the virus and then the rest of the world will be spared. Well, not only did that not happen, but we started to see an incredible disruption in the supply chain for manufactured goods. Components and parts of pieces of machinery that we needed to make, we couldn't access because global trade came to a screeching halt. We saw large auto manufacturers declare that they weren't doing well. We've seen what's happened to the airlines. We've seen the tourist industries in all countries go belly up. We've seen that we can't even do business as usual with political campaigning and rallies. We can't all get together in these vast stadiums. We can't get together to watch sports in sports arenas. Our whole way of imbibing culture has changed, and on and on and on. So this interconnectedness that we have is becoming very, very apparent. And some of us may need to be beaten on the head a little more before we truly get our oneness. And it will lead to a complete transformation eventually. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But I want to talk more about this whole process of integration and disintegration. This analogy of a caterpillar that morphs into a butterfly is actually a very apt one. So let's take a look at it. When a caterpillar starts off life, here it is. First of all, it's earthbound, right? Crawls along, and its sole job in life is to eat as much as it can possibly eat. It eats and eats and eats and eats, and in fact gets so fat that it can no longer stay in its cover. And it has to burst out, it has to shed that cover, continues to eat, 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 eat. Now I'm dramatizing this, but I want to create an image in your head. It eats some more, again, expands even more, has to come out of its skin again. And the process keeps going until the caterpillar gets to the place where it can no longer shed its skin. At that point, it does what you start to see on this image here on this slide. It cocoons itself. On the right side, you see the cocoon. Now, what happens once it cocoons itself? It starts to excrete enzymes. Those enzymes start eating the body of the caterpillar up. So it literally starts to destroy itself. The process, if you could get into the cocoon and could see it, or if you break a cocoon open, you'll see is disgusting. It's gooey, it's messy, it's smelly, it's really something unpalatable. And so you have this process of disintegration. This is the disintegration of the old caterpillar. Meanwhile, the caterpillar, unbeknownst to most of us who are looking at this thing crawling along, has always had within it certain latent cells called imaginal discs. These discs represent parts of a new butterfly to be sometime in the future, but they're latent, nobody pays any attention to them. Well, once we get into the cocooning phase, these cells, each of these imaginal discs represents one part of the body of the butterfly, the new entity that's to emerge. And there's just a small number of cells for each part. Well, inside this cocooning period, these cells start to multiply rapidly. Again, it's out of sight. We're not seeing this happening, but they're multiplying rapidly. So as the caterpillar is disintegrating and turning into a disgusting goop, these cells, these discs, are busy producing more cells, and they're starting to build the parts of the butterfly. And then eventually, of course, what happens when the butterfly is ready, it breaks open the shell of the cocoon, and what we see is this beautifully emerged new being. Now look at the differences between this new being and the old. The butterfly can fly. It has perspective that the caterpillar, which was earthbound, never had before. And it's a completely new order of creation. Now look at our world. We have been rapaciously consuming for decades. Materialism has reached its height. We buy, 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 buy. We need more gadgets. We need a better home. We need to upgrade this. I need to upgrade that. I need new clothes. I need the new trend, the fastest, most recent car. I want that new a vacation home. I want that vacation. I want. And as we have been consuming unthinkingly and mindlessly, we've literally been destroying our world, as is evident with climate change. This unsustainable consumption has put us in incredible danger of now a whole series of calamities that are coming down the pike. Whether we like it or not, we can still mitigate them. But as we've seen with the wildfires in Australia and in the Amazon and in the Congo Basin, and with the drought and with the flooding and the cyclones and all of this, that we're in for quite a wild and difficult ride. So that is us, the caterpillar, consuming itself and getting fatter and fatter and fatter. And now we're in the process of disintegration. Even global pandemics and viruses are caused when we disturb the ecosystems of the world. That's what scientists tell us. So the worse climate change gets, the more susceptible we're going to be to more and more and more of these viruses. So this may be the first of a number coming for us down the years. So this for me is a fascinating, but at the end of the day, what are we working towards? We're working towards a new global civilization that is going to be marked by the notion that we are one. We recognize that we are interconnected, that we have become a single unit. The world has become like a body. And we'll recognize that given that that's the case, we need to start building institutions that are collective decision-making institutions that have the power to pass binding international legislation that say, hey, you can't burn this kind of energy. This is the kind of energy you can burn in these quantities, that will actually put the funding into finding alternative, renewable, clean sources of energy. We need these collective decision-making institutes to solve a whole host of problems, including problems like this pandemic. Had we had a global institution that was truly representative of the peoples of the world and that truly functioned on the basis of transparency, openness, and had the power to bind states, we would have been a lot better off with this pandemic. Okay, let's move on to the next thing. The next lens that the Baha'i writings give us is that these ordeals and calamities will weld the component parts of our international being, our different component parts, the different nations, the different ethnicities, the different races, into what? A single, organic, indivisible, world-embracing community. Now, again, it's just worth dwelling very briefly on this image of welding. You know, when you bring two cold pieces of metal together, they're not going to bond. The only way to make these rigid pieces of metal that are very stuck in their own identities bond is by lighting a very, very, very hot fire underneath them, raising the temperatures, so that these, the rigidity will melt and soften. And at that point, when it's soft enough, you can weld these two together. This is exactly what the fires of the COVID-19 crisis and the global economic recession that is coming, this is what they're going to serve to do. And whether they will achieve their purpose or not, or whether we need more calamities, is completely up to us. You know, the Baha'i writings tell us that God, out of his love or her love for us, has given us free will choice. It is an incredible gift we have. But there are consequences to how we use it. And I don't mean punishment, I mean cause and effect. If you take a glass and bring it to the edge of a table, the law of gravity is going to take over and it is going to drop and it's likely to break. You can't say, oh, I was punished because I did that. No, this was cause and effect. The same is true with our behavior. If we take smart and intelligent steps and we start quickly making the changes in the world we need, moving towards a new system of global governance that we need, then we will be able to forestall some of these global challenges, or at least deal with them effectively once they arise. If not, it is clear from my reading of the Baha'i writings that we are in for more and more and more suffering until we get the message. And as we go through, we'll see some of this. So here we go. Humanity, the Baha'i writings tell us, is being purged. Wow, cleansed, right? Why? In order to prepare it for its future mission. The Baha'i writings say something very interesting apropos of that. Here's the quotation from Shoghi Effendi. Mankind is being simultaneously called to give account for its past actions and being purged and prepared for its future mission. It can neither escape the responsibilities of the past nor shirk those of the future. So, you know, we can't expect to have behaved a certain way over decades and not pay the price for it. There's a spiritual price and there's also just the physical price. We can't expect to have depleted our natural resources and consumed and burnt all these fossil fuels and put all this CO2 in the environment and not suffer the consequences. It's not magically going to disappear. Now we've actually got to deal with it. So we have responsibilities from our past, and we're going to have responsibilities in the future, which we're not going to be allowed to shirk. Later in that same work, Shuri Effendi said that that our Creator loves us so much that He is not willing to let us squander our birthright of a glorious destiny away. It's like a loving parent who, when you see the child going off track, you train them and you bring them back, and sometimes it requires some form of punishment so that they get the lesson. The punishment isn't punishment for the sake of punishment, but punishment for the sake of edifying and preparing that child so that once it's an adult, it can function in a way that is constructive and empowering and contributive to the world of humanity. All right. Now, what will these tribulations purge us of? The Baha'i writings, again, provide some very specific ideas, particularly in addressing the American nation, which Shuri Effendi did in a letter from which this quote is taken. These phrases that you see on your slide come straight from that. Ingrained racial prejudice is one of them. Something that we are seeing, and right now these crises are, it seems like these crises have pulled the veil off from our eyes, and so much of the rot that has been in the soil of our communities is starting to come to the surface. So we need to purge ourselves of our racial prejudice, especially in this country. Rampant materialism, that, as we mentioned a minute ago, is contributing to immense problems, including the huge disparity between the rich and the poor, which is becoming very apparent in this COVID-19 crisis. Who are the people who are suffering the most? It is the poor, it is people of color, the people who have suffered under unjust systems that are based upon and grounded in racial prejudice. The other thing we're purging ourselves of is ungodliness, this idea that we are supreme and that there is nothing greater than us that is in control of our world. Well, again, if this crisis is teaching us anything, is that we're not as in control as we appear to think we are. And in countries like the United States, where frankly our hubris and arrogance had led to complacency, thinking, oh, we'll be fine with this virus. We're not like China. We're not like other countries. We've got our act together. Well, we're now finding out that actually maybe there is room for growth. And that understanding is a good thing, because growing, taking opportunities for growth is always a plus. And then there's moral laxity. Which again is something that one can go through in detail, but I think for now speaks for itself. The next lens. Now, many of my friends I know are really scared that this is kind of the end of the world, the end of civilization as we know it. As a Baha'i, I don't have that fear, because for one, the Baha'i writings assure me and all of us that these calamities that were foretold that would come and that have started to happen in my mind are not the end of civilization. We've been promised that we will not destroy ourselves. You know, for human psychology is important. And it's important to have faith and belief that this is not the end. Because if we thought it was the end, what do we go back to that first mindset? Oh, we're helpless. What's the point? Might as well just lay down and die. Eat, watch movies, don't go to school anymore, don't go to work anymore, just live it up and have a good life, because we're all going to hell in a handbasket anyway, right? So this all of a sudden wakes us up to the fact that, oh, no, we're going to be going. And so what is the kind of life we want to have? So move on to the next lens. These convulsive changes not only won't completely destroy us, but they will release the potentialities that are latent within us. And will lead to a radical change in our very conception of society. For me, this is probably the most important quotation from the Baha'i writings. It is, and the most important lens. The idea that everything that we're going through right now, no matter how painful, is worth it. Why? Because ultimately, it will do several things. Start with number 3 on the slide. They will stir the conscience of the world. Well, let's look at it. Our conscience is already starting to be stirred. This is just the beginning. There is starting to be, we've never wanted to look fully in the face at how the extremes of wealth and poverty are affecting people in this country and in other parts of the world. You know, I was struck by the story in Singapore that Singapore did a really good job of containing the virus, and they thought they were home free, until guess what? They had a massive outbreak in dormitories in which their migrant workers live. So these migrant workers come from other countries in Asia, and there are about 200,000 of them in the country, but they live in these cramped dormitories, usually 8 to a room. Every 15 of them has one bathroom that they share, and the living conditions are really not good. So this was kind of the underbelly of Singaporean society. Nobody ever looked at it. It's like, oh, out of sight, out of mind, we don't have to deal with it. Well, guess what? They've had a horrible outbreak of coronavirus in the dorms. And the government is now starting to realize, it's not like we can just leave them to their own devices. This coronavirus is going to then come into the community, and we're going to have community spread. It's going to affect everyone. Why? Because we're all interconnected. And so it's bringing to light the kind of conditions in which these people lived, and it's starting to stir the conscience of people. Same with race. How the virus has impacted, and the economic crisis is impacting people of color and Black people more, say, in this country, and not just here, all around the world, more than others. People also who live in refugee camps, who have been kicked out on the grounds of ethnicity or race or nationalism or religion, or who are fleeing their countries because of violence. They are also incredibly susceptible to the coronavirus. So the conscience of the world is slowly being stirred. Number 4, these crises, this adversity, will disillusion the masses. Now, before we're willing to totally change our systems and the way we do things, we have to reach a certain level of disillusionment. And these crises are going to be the thing that does it. So every time you feel yourself starting to get depressed about the state of the world and what's going on, remind yourself, this is serving a purpose. It's stirring the conscience of the world. It is going to cause disillusionment, yes, but that disillusionment will, number 5, precipitate a radical change in the very conception of society, and will coalesce, this is from the writings, the bleeding limbs of mankind into a single organic and indivisible whole. So, we are already starting to see calls for this radical change in the conception of society. You know, Baha'u'llah in the 1860s wrote letters addressing all the kings and rulers of the world, and the one that he wrote to Queen Victoria of Britain talks about the need for parliamentary representatives, so kind of like our members of Congress, when they deliberate, to think about the good of all humanity, not just about the good of their country. That's amazing, okay? This is in the 1860s. Fast forward to today, climate change. We have to have leaders who, in their deliberations in Congress and whatever the parliaments are they're debating in, or their cabinets, that when they talk about making laws or establishing policies, that they take into account all the peoples of the world with climate change, because climate change, like the pandemic, knows no boundaries. It doesn't stop outside our borders. So our actions will affect everyone else, and everyone else's actions will affect us. Now, in the wake of the coronavirus crisis, we have started to see calls from some world leaders of calling for the creation of a limited global government. I think it's fascinating. And at the very least, for a complete overhaul of our system of global decision-making and global governance. So to give you examples, the former Prime Minister of Britain, Gordon Brown, said, the only way to resolve these two crises is to create some form of limited world government. Once you start, and if we have a successful experience with it, we realize, yes, there are other collective problems that can only be solved collectively, for which we also need, say, a world parliament, right? That has the binding authority to create legislation that binds all the nations in certain very narrow spheres that affect our collective interests, like the pandemic and climate change. The foreign minister of Spain, Ms. Laya, she also said, look, we need to stop playing around here. We need to look at our global institutions, see what works, what doesn't work, throw it out the window. What works, keep it, and what needs to be improved and reformed, let's go ahead and do it. There have been others. There was an article by, an opinion piece by Henry Kissinger, and there are other leaders that are calling for something similar. Ultimately, what is going to lead to this radical change is an understanding that the world is one. And to that end, I want to share another analogy that's given by one of these other thought leaders in our world. He's a professor in Singapore who was also a diplomat for many years. He says that whereas the world used to be like 193 boats floating on the ocean of international life, we have now become a ship with 193 cabins. He says the problem is, while each of the cabins is extremely well run internally and has stewards and staff to take care of internal needs, the ship as a whole lacks both a captain and crew. So once we face turbulent seas, as we are with COVID-19, I'm adding this now, the COVID-19 and the global economic recession, there is no captain at the helm of this ship. There is nobody to steer us collectively to safety. And our destinies interlinked. So we either sink or swim together. So this is the kind of understanding that is going to come as a result of this adversity. All right, the next lens is that this is another really interesting thing from the Baha'i writings, that the ordeals will instill in our leaders the necessary sense of responsibility to take action. Wow, this is something we're really seeing play out real time in so many parts of the world. Our leaders have abdicated their responsibility. They've made it, so many of them have made it about them, about who they are, about whether they can win a next election, as opposed to what's good for their people, and beyond that, what's good for the people of the world. And we see the difference in those very small handful of countries where leaders have risen and displayed a sense of responsibility and compassion. And it's interesting because we're starting to see these qualities finally being valued that have genuinely been regarded as feminine qualities: compassion, understanding, cooperation, intuition, right? And we see this, I mean, I have to call her out because she's done such an amazing job, the leader of New Zealand, right? Going out there, demonstrating compassion towards those who are suffering, demonstrating love, but also being very firm about, yes, we all have to stay home. Yes, we all have to wear masks. And now they've completely contained the virus, and they're able to get back to life while also being sensible about how they do it. And also maintaining the unity within their country, that all important thing, unity versus the polarization that is more of that disintegration. We don't need more disintegration. We now need more movements of integration. All right. we're getting close to the end here. The suffering will also instill in us the necessary capacity, virtues, powers, and moral standards to take us to the next stage in our development, to move beyond what we term this collective turbulent adolescence towards adulthood. And those capacities and powers, in my mind, to a large extent, will include a new system of global governance and a new system of global ethics, that all the leaders will come together and say, okay, what are the values that animate us? What is our shared system of global values? And they will use that as the launching pad for creating a new system of global governance, of creating a world parliament, of a world executive, of a new international court that actually has compulsory jurisdiction and has the ability to maintain peace in the world without nations resolving to conflict and war. And these global ethics need to be woven into the very fabric of these global institutions. These are some of the new capacities and powers that the Baha'i writings talk about, and that as I see emerging as a next step. The last lens is that this travail and sorrow helps to create spiritual awareness. You know, difficulty and suffering in life is always an invitation to us to go deeper and examine who we really are. Very often we think of ourselves and of each other in very superficial terms. And in fact, here's the image. We look at each other and we just see the physical. Oh, she has such gorgeous hair. Oh, I love that piece of jewelry you're wearing. Oh, that's so trendy. Or, oh my gosh, he's got such an amazing job, or she's become a CEO of a Fortune 500 company. Oh, wow, she is, you know, the top prosecutor. She's become Attorney General. All these superficial, materialistic aspects of our life are foremost, and it is what we see. It's very normal that they should be foremost because that's what we see. Oh, where did you go to school? What part of town do you live in? What kind of clothes do you wear? Whom do you associate with? But those are just the tips of the iceberg. If we think of each of ourselves as an iceberg, what we see is just the tip of the iceberg. And scientists will tell you that's 10% of who we are, or what an iceberg is. And it's 10%, I would say, of who we are. Who we truly are, the 90%, the real we, is hidden, and it's something we need to explore and understand and reflect on. And again, I sometimes sit and think, wow, this is another amazing opportunity that COVID-19 has given us. This precious time to be at home and reflect, because we can't go out shopping and partying, or even go, you know, to our houses of worship, or go to sports games, or go to concerts. No, what are we doing? We're sitting at home. And yes, while we can be spending all our time watching Netflix, we also have the opportunity, should we want to take it, to reflect about who are we? Who am I? Who have I been until today? Do I need to be the same person going forward? What is the vision that I have for the WHO, that I want to be in the future? Once I have that vision, what do I need to do to get me from here to there? And the same goes for our communities. What kind of community do we want to be going forward? And one of the wonderful aspects of COVID that I wish the media would report on more often is the amazing acts of kindness that this crisis is bringing out with people. It's really very gratifying to see. If you haven't read it, a couple of days ago, there was a wonderful piece in the New York Times by David Brooks, one of the columnists, and in which he talks about him reflecting on this. And he's saying, frankly, I didn't know that the American community writ large had so much kindness and compassion in it. I didn't know we had it in us. And he's been amazed and gratified to see that. All right, so once we create this new mindset, this alternative mindset, using these lenses that the Baha'i writings provide us with. Whether you're a Baha'i or not, it doesn't matter. You can choose to perceive the world through these lenses if you find that it leads to a more constructive, empowering way of being, right? So when you see a good thing, go for it. So if we adopt these new mindsets, they're like a stepping stone to the kind of world we want. They allow us to see opportunity in disaster. They allow us to view failure as an opportunity to grow, as opposed to a calamity in and of itself. And they give us hope and courage. These are qualities that Shuri Effendi asked the Baha'is to develop during these hard times. Hope and courage is one, confidence and assurance. And to spur our creativity so that we're energized, get off our couches, and act with energy and tireless effort in order to create the new world that we want to create. A peaceful world, a more secure world in which we can all actualize our individual and collective potential. And for those, I'm going to end with a quote from Abdu'l-Baha in which he responds to the skeptics who say, oh, world peace, that's not possible. He says, a few unaware of the power latent in human endeavor consider this matter as highly impracticable, nay, even beyond the scope of man's utmost efforts. Such is not the case, however. On the contrary, thanks to the unfailing grace of God, the loving kindness of his favored ones, the unrivaled endeavors of wise and capable souls, and the thoughts and ideas of the peerless leaders of this age, nothing whatsoever can be regarded as unattainable. Endeavor, ceaseless endeavor is required. Nothing short of an indomitable determination can possibly achieve it. Then he reminds us, many a cause which past ages have regarded as purely visionary, yet in this day has become most easy and practicable. Why should this most greaty and lofty cause, the day star of the firmament of true civilization and the cause of the glory, the advancement, the well-being, and the success of all humanity, why should this be regarded as impossible of achievement? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Maani, for providing us those very encouraging insights for the different purposes that this pandemic can serve and the steps we need to take both individually and as a global community. So we already have a couple questions. The first is from Erwin, who says, please comment on how this pandemic can purge humanity of destructive habits associated with how we treat animals and how we raise animals for food, and how this purging can have the practical effect of preventing future pandemics of this sort. Thank you.
Oh, very specific question. Thanks, Erwin. So, we talked about one of the lessons that seem to be within the design of these calamities is to recognize our interconnectedness, not just the interconnectedness between human beings, but our oneness as a planet, our interconnectedness with nature, which includes with animals. And so that's part one. Part two is this. So we talked about climate change. So and these are obviously just personal views of mine. Fortunately, in the Baha'i faith, we don't have clergy. And so here I am, just an individual able to reflect on the Baha'i writings and to make correlations. So when I look at the COVID-19, it is a particular, right now, we're very focused on human health. Appropriately so, because the house is on fire, we have to put the fire out. And that's where most of our energy is going. However, the capabilities and the capacities and the understandings that are coming to us as we learn to deal effectively with the COVID-19 crisis are also demonstrating that we need these same capabilities in order to deal with other crises, including climate change. Climate change is a slow rolling disaster. The pandemic is a fast rolling disaster. Climate change is a slow rolling disaster. But in order to address it, we need similar capacities and capabilities to the ones that we are learning the hard way to build with COVID-19. In other words, learning how to collaborate, how to cooperate, how to be transparent, how to look at our systems, like our healthcare system. Gee, we don't really have one that's effective, say, in this country. What are we going to do about that? Oh, our system of employment and safety nets for people when they become unemployment. What, if anything, are we going to do about that? So we're examining systems. Now, with climate change, we also get to examine systems. And I think it's with climate change that we're going to start to see systems like agriculture, how we treat animals, what is sustainable, what isn't, really come into play. Why? Because with climate change, we're decimating large areas of coastal land. So the waters are going to rise and we're literally going to lose large swaths of land. Swaths of land on which people live. People will have to move further inland. A lot of land that used to be used for agriculture will now have to be used to sustain human beings in other ways. We're depleting our freshwater systems. Also the droughts, the wildfires. So in Australia, not only did we have the bushfires that destroyed property and animals, they said over 1 billion. I mean, it's just stunning when you think about the numbers. And this was just one season of wildfires, right? From end of 2019 to the beginning of 2020. In addition to that, what they're now finding, knock-on effects from climate change, which caused the drought, which caused the bushfires, now it's affecting water systems because all the ash and debris from the fires has ended up in the rivers and the lakes and is clogging them up and killing the fish. They're reporting all kinds of creatures in these lakes escaping from the water. You know, fish never want to come out of water. They're going for dry land because they think it's better than being in the water that's killing them because of the lack of oxygen. So this is, I think, an awareness and an understanding, Erwin, that is going to come. It's going to be a process. One of the things that's already started happening with COVID, apropos of how we produce food, is raising awareness of the fact that, oh, wow, the people who grow our food are really important. Maybe we should treat them better than we treat a basketball player or a movie star because our lives actually depend on farmers. Oh, wow, the people who work in hospitals and healthcare are really important. But with agriculture, we're also starting to look and see, well, what's sustainable, what isn't. I just read an article this morning, actually, that in Italy, a lot of people who have lost their jobs in the economy, so people who were in there were some highfalutin companies that they were running as CEOs in Rome, are now working as farmhands in the countryside because it's the only job they can get to sustain their lives. And the awareness has come to them. They had interviewed some of these people, said, gosh, we realize that agricultural is really a mainstay of our economies, and we hadn't really thought about how important farming is. So this is a slow growing awareness that is coming, and the more we suffer, the more this awareness will grow. I hope this goes some ways towards answering your question.
Thank you. Our next question is from Emmanuel. I'm going to unmute you now so you can ask your question.
Hi, Sovaida. I really enjoyed your presentation. I mean, it's so articulate, and I cannot wait to share it with a lot of friends who could be helped just listening to your talk. But I agree with you that we are now in a situation where, I mean, there are so many good opportunities to really develop in the right way. But at this point in time, I have the feeling we are about 50-50. 50 chances to go the right way and 50%, I mean, just to continue with our old ways. And recently I stumbled upon a quote by Abdul Baha, which I believe summarize if we continue to go towards our old ways. So I wanted to share it with you. Tests are a means by which a soul is measured as to its fitness and proven out by its own acts. Man with an ego would not believe himself unfit unless proof were given him. Consequently, his susceptibility to evil is proven to him when he falls into the tests, and the tests are continued until the soul realizes its own unfitness. Then remorse and regret tend to root out the weakness. The same test comes again in greater degree until it's shown that the former weakness has become a strength and the power to overcome evil has been established. So I think at this time we can go either way, but if we continue towards our old ways, well, we'll probably face even bigger challenges in the future.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Absolutely. Thank you very much for sharing that quote, which is very apropos. And that reminds me again of this adversity bringing a radical change in our very conception of society. But look at what was going to happen before we got there. And I didn't linger on it, but I've pulled up the slide again. The process will be prolonged. Okay, so people who think, oh, we're going to be done with this coronavirus crisis and go back to business as usual, I doubt it. For one, we have climate change waiting in the wings and at work, and now we have a global economic recession to deal with. So it will be prolonged and worldwide. Wow, okay, so we're all in this test that you were describing from that quote. So we're all being tested individually and collectively. Will be accompanied with chaos and universal destruction. So we're already starting to see glimmerings of chaos, but I think that over the next few months and year, we're going to see the kind of chaos we never expected to see anywhere. People, imagine these large numbers of people without jobs. What are people going to do? How are they going to eat? How are they going to sustain themselves? How are they going to provide for schooling and shelter for their children? And they're not going to just sit down and take it, right? So chaos and universal destruction. And then in the meantime, the conscience of the world is being stirred and the disillusionment occurs. And it's when you get to that point, as you say, the question is going to be, when is suffering going to be enough? And that depends on our free will choice. In other words, how much tolerance do we have for suffering? When are we going to say, okay, enough is enough. We now need to make changes. And yes, we recognize that we are physical beings we are spiritual beings having a physical experience, as opposed to physical beings occasionally dabbling in something that involves, you know, spiritual qualities or a concept of spirituality. And yes, we are one. Okay, I truly get it. We are one. You know, there was a letter from the governing body of the Baha'i faith in January of 2019. It was a follow-up statement to the statement they'd issued in 1985, the promise of world peace. And in it, they talk about exactly what you're saying, Emmanuel, that that right now, and this was before COVID, obviously, the trajectory that the world is on is one in which we're moving towards increasing nationalism and authoritarianism and going, and we're reversing. Remember we talked about what the psychologist said, we're reversing some of the progress we made. Well, the House of Justice referred to that, not in the context of psychology, but in the context of what they could see was happening in the world and what they predicted was going to be coming. And you remember the phrase they used in that letter? They said, so be it. So be it if we're going towards basically a more destructive path. But they said, as Baha'is, we know we're not going to be disheartened by it because we know that peace will come. It's a matter of faith for us. It's not just oh, gee, we had the opportunity and it was lost. The only question really is how soon. And you're absolutely right that the tests will keep coming and keep coming. And the suffering, like the labor pains, we're going to get more and more and more calamities. If we don't learn with COVID and this global economic recession, we'll have another crisis and another and another. We may have a, you know, who knows, a nuclear war, this, that, could be a whole bunch of things until we're felled down to our knees and finally realize that we have to change. Okay.
Thank you. We have another question asking if you would be able to share your PowerPoint presentation with people who are interested.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, great.
Let me take you back. If those of you who want to get in touch with me, if you go to the slide, you'll see a website here, cpgg.org. If you click on it, you'll find my email. There's a contact button. Just get in touch with me and I'll be happy to send it to you.
Great, thank you. Our next question, I believe, from Mercedes is, in the era of tribalism and everyone sticking to their own belief of what's the best solution, having confirmation biases, how Baha'i should interact in a unified manner with contrarians and those with different beliefs and at times obnoxious ones.
Okay. Don't get sucked in. Let me just share what I do that I have found effective. Look, ultimately we can't control other people, and this is where the wisdom begins. It is understandable. So the first thing I do is I acknowledge and validate the emotions people are having, not what they are saying as a solution. I will say something like, gosh, you know, I can hear the fear, the frustration, the whatever in your voice, the anxiety, because underlying these manifestations of tribalism and polarization is really fear. When you dig, you see it's because people are scared and they have somehow come to believe that their solution is the only valid one. And so when you start viewing it from that vantage point, you see it's perfectly understandable. If I thought that there was a remedy to this whole thing and that I was right, I would be desperate and controlling and try to shove this remedy down everybody's throat, right? So you can acknowledge their sincerity, you can acknowledge their fear, you can acknowledge their anxiety, you can acknowledge their frustration, and then you can just listen to them. And then say, that's interesting. You're not condoning. And then say, you know, here's another, this is the way I tend to view these things, or may I share with you another way of looking at this? I'm curious to know what you think. And then you say, then you give them, and this is where we have to be ready and have our arguments marshaled about the evidences. Why, how do we know we're interconnected? Why do you say we're interconnected? Show me. Well, isn't globalization interconnectedness a bad thing? And this is when we say, you know, we have become interconnected like a body. And once we become like a body, it's very normal that a body becomes prone to systemic risk. So once you have a disease like cancer, the kidney can't say to the liver, I'm just out for me. I take care of number one and you go take care of yourself. That's what our world has become like. One country can't say to another, I take care of me. I do vaccines for me. I get personal protective equipment for me, etc., etc. We're all in this together. And we're only as healthy as our weakest link. So if we eradicate the coronavirus in the Western Hemisphere, but say the African continent gets hit, with the interconnectedness and the travel that we have, it's not going to stay there. We're all going to be affected by it. So you start to marshal these rational arguments, and then you take it level by level. And you offer it to people in the spirit of humility and keep asking for so what do you think? What's your feedback? And meet them where they are. But initially they're going to need to just, you know, their cup is full. They're going to need to share and unburden their souls. And one of the things I've learned is I struggle with impatience. And I have to learn to be very patient as I listen, as I say, and then acknowledge and validate people's feelings and their sincerity. And, you know, we can't assume that people aren't sincere. People may have ideas that we think are harebrained, but it doesn't mean that they're not sincere. And so if we focus on that, people will pick up on it. When we can actually treat people with dignity and treat them as our equal intellectually and otherwise, and say, yeah, you know, I can see that you're really concerned about the state of your country or the world or your community. And that's such a wonderful quality. Then they'll start to relax, because what people are waiting for is that opposition, because that's what we're used to in our society. We take a firm stand because we know that somebody's going to come at us. Every time you turn on the news or a news program, it really bugs me. Somebody says something and the media person immediately tries to politicize this instead of taking it to the human level. So I hope that helps.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions, but I'm just going to pause for a second in case anyone has any last minute questions. Okay, well, in that case, thank you so much again. Our speaker next week will be Dr. Roya Achavan, and the topic will be Reasons for Hope. We're now going to have a closing prayer read by Bita.
Remove not, O Lord, the festal board that hath been spread in thy name, and extinguish not the burning flame that hath been kindled by thine unquenchable fire. Withhold not flowing that living water of thine that murmureth with the melody of thy glory and thy remembrance, and deprive not thy servants from the fragrance of thy sweet savors, breathing forth the perfume of thy love. Lord, turn the distressing cares of thy holy ones into ease, their hardship into comfort, their abasement into glory, their sorrow into blissful joy, O thou that holdest in thy grasp the reins of all mankind. Thou art verily the one, the single, the mighty, the all-knowing, the all-wise.
Hope everyone has a great week, and we will see you next Sunday.
Thank you.